Hello and welcome to History Hack's dedicated Second World War air power podcast, Hedge-Hopping, with me, Matt Bone. Today, I am delighted to welcome a fellow Canadian to the podcast. Mike Bechthold is an author, a historian, and a cartographer who specializes in the fields of military air power, the Canadian Army in Normandy and Northwest Europe, and the Canadian Corps in the Great War. His speciality, though, is in tactical air operations in both First and Second World Wars, and it's going to be the latter that we will be discussing today. He currently teaches history at Wilfrid Laurier University and the Schulich School of Business at York University. Mike, thanks for spending time with us.
Thanks, Matt. I'm really happy to be here. I have to say that History Hack has been one of my absolute delights during this whole lockdown period. Not much good has come out of this period, but History Hack has been fantastic, and I'm glad to be on your show today.
We're delighted to have you, and thank you for that. The check is in the post. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about what we're going to discuss today? So we will be discussing the Battle of Bardia because we're recording this on the 80th anniversary of the battle today. But there's a little bit more to the story as well. So who are we going to be using as our entry into the battle?
Yeah, we're going to be looking at the Battle of Bardia through the eyes of Raymond Kalashaw, who was a great Canadian figure of the First World War. And if anybody around the world knows about him, they know about him as a Great War fighter ace. He was very skilled. He had 60 kills on the Western Front. He was second to Billy Bishop, another famous Canadian ace in terms of the totals, and had a very successful First World War career. But years ago, when I was reading through his memoirs, he had a throwaway line that said that of all the things I've accomplished in my life, the things I'm most proud of are my performance during the Western Desert Campaign. And that really made me scratch my head because I didn't even know what the Western Desert Campaign was, let alone why Kalashaw would be proud of it. But he had a really interesting career. After the First World War, he stayed in the RAF, one of the few pilots who was invited to do that. He was sent off to South Russia, where he fought against the Bolsheviks. He was in the Middle East fighting against insurgents in Iraq and Persia. He was one of the first commanders of an air group on a Royal Navy aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean. And at the start of the Second World War, he found himself as the senior operational RAF commander in the Western Desert in Egypt. So was involved in the early battles against the Italians and then the Germans, and had a big role to play. And as I started looking into his life and his career, I found that he had a really big role to play into developing the Allied system of close air support, of tactical air support that was used for the rest of the war. And he was somebody that was worth writing about.
I think let's dig into that sort of birth of tactical air. He had a stellar career air to air, but how did he get down low, especially in that last 100 days in the Battle of Amiens?
Yeah, so the genesis of air power in the First World War is a really interesting story. I mean, it started with the aircraft being used for reconnaissance, and then as the aircraft started bumping into each other, they started fighting. And initially it was with hand grenades and pistols, and some intrepid guys even took rifles up to try to shoot, and it didn't work very well. But over time, it developed into the scout aircraft, what's known as a fighter today, where they had machine guns mounted on the front, and its job was to go out and hunt other airplanes. So when we look at the air war in the First World War today, everybody knows about the great aces, von Richthofen, Bishop, Kalashaw, Manic, those guys. And those are the stories that are exciting to tell. But that was all really just a sideline. Air power in the First World War was really mostly about reconnaissance, about getting intelligence by flying over the enemy lines, taking pictures, finding out what the enemy is doing, and also artillery spotting, putting aircraft in the air to watch the fall of shot and direct the artillery. Those are the really important things that air power was doing. And the fighters, the scouts, were going up to prevent that from happening. But it all ties into this idea of daring do in the sky, of the knights of the air, of these great chivalrous stories of sort of days of yore and everything like that. And that was really only an outcome of what air power was really doing. Later on in the war, they discovered that air power could be applied on the battlefield. by bringing planes down to do what they called trench strafing, to drop bombs, to do interdiction. And so by 1918, we see that all the components of air power that we see in play today were being trialed in one form or another. Reconnaissance, strategic bombing, airlift, interdiction, all those things were trialed. And Kalashaw was one of the first practitioners of ground strafing. He commanded 203 Squadron, number 3 Naval, which then became 203 Squadron when the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Naval Air Service joined on the 1st of April, 1918. And through the German March offensives and then the great last 100 days campaign, one of the main tasks of his squadron was to do trench strafing to support the armies on the battlefield. So he figured out what worked and what didn't work. And I have to say that pilots, and Kalashaw in particular, hated doing trench strafing. It was dangerous work. He said very clearly that he felt in his environment when he was up high dogfighting, because he knew that he could trust his skill and his aircraft. And he mostly flew the Sopwith Camel during this period, and he thought it was just an absolute wonderful aircraft that did everything he wanted. But he said when he got down low, down 100 feet over the ground, and was doing ground strafing, he said that luck was more important than skill. He said it didn't matter if you were an experienced pilot or a newbie on his first flight, you had just as much chance of getting shot down by ground fire or crashing into the ground or having some other unfortunate thing happen to you. And it was just something they really didn't like. On the first day of the Battle of Amiens on the 8th of August, 1918, the great advance by the Canadian and Australian corps. Kalashaw was in the air for about 10 hours that day over the battlefield, and he said almost all of it was flying 100 feet or below, and he crashed one plane during the course of the day, got shot up on other cases, and it was just a very dangerous thing. But he, through this experience, learned what worked and what didn't work during close air support missions.
That was sort of the birth of the All-Arms battle, they called it, wasn't it? It was all forms, the Army, the artillery, and the Air Forces working as closely together as possible to create the breakthroughs that hadn't happened for the previous 4 years.
Yeah, for sure. And it was during this period that Kalashaw really realized that close air support of the type that the Army wanted, sort of using aircraft to impact where the soldiers are fighting, wasn't very effective. You could do it in an emergency, it could have an immediate impact, but over the long term, it was unsustainable. The losses were too high, the casualties were too great, and you couldn't do it. And what air power could really do was isolate the battlefield. So do interdiction, try to prevent troops from moving up to the front, try to hit bridges, hit supply columns and things like that. And that's where the real value of close air support was.
Let's move forward now to the Russian Civil War, which is the Allied involvement on the white side against the Bolsheviks, which is one of those things that people don't really like to talk about. So how did Kalashaw find himself involved in that conflict?
Yeah, like I said, Kalashaw had been appointed as one of the few RAF pilots to remain in the Royal Air Force after the end of the war. The vast majority of pilots were demobilized. The British just didn't need that many pilots, but Kalashaw was identified as a very good commander, and that's something that is going to be important in our story. So many pilots were very good pilots, but they turned out to be not very good commanders. And I'm going to annoy some of my fellow Canadians by this next statement, but Billy Bishop is this great case of an exceptional pilot who was a terrible commander. He just didn't have the big picture, the ability to see the big picture. And so when he was put in command of a squadron, he wasn't able to set aside his own hunting instincts and want to go and do things. So, I mean, the great story that is a comparison for me in that is there was at least one case where Billy Bishop was asked to take a new pilot up to show him the ropes and everything like that. And Bishop took him up and was taking him over lines, and somewhere off in the distance he saw some German planes, so he went off and worked to shoot them down. And while that happened, the green pilot he was entrusted to was shot down and killed. That's not very good. The same token, and I don't know if this is true, but the stories told of Kalashaw say that when he was introducing a new pilot to the lines, he would take them up and would find some two-seater artillery spotter aircraft, a relatively easy target, and he would guide his pilot in to do it, and then he'd fall back and let the guy start shooting at him. And while the green pilot was shooting at the two-seater, he would come up below and fire into that two-seater himself and shoot it down. And then when they landed, he would give the new pilot credit for doing it as a way of building up his confidence and showing him that he could do it and everything like that. So to me, that's a really different perspective on command. One is out for the individual glory, the other is in it for the betterment of the squadron, and that's something we see over and over again in Kalashaw's career.
So he was sent over to Russia in command. How did that work out for them?
It went really well for Kalashaw in one respect. He was a very good commander. He was used to working on his own, so he didn't need anybody looking over his shoulder to do it. And that's a good thing, because South Russia was a long way from anywhere, and he often didn't have anybody except his own ideas to carry him through. And in many ways, it was the Wild West of battlefields. The Bolsheviks were operating over a big area, the White Russians. We like to think about an army being unified and under one control, but the White Russians had different factions that had different ideas that were going in different places. So he had command of 47 Squadron, and it was really put into, was it 2 or 3 separate flights that operated mostly independently. It's kind of interesting that they were each assigned their own armored train, and the aircraft would be, the wings would be taken off and they'd be put on the train, and they'd go off to wherever they would be. They would find some convenient flat field, and they would take the planes off and have a sort of an ad hoc airfield in the middle of nowhere. They would continue living on the train, and that was sort of how they operated. But the stories there were kind of crazy. More than once, Kalashana's pilots were engaging Bolshevik cavalry, going and strafing them. He was called on to fight in, well, what became Stalingrad on the Volga River. I forget what it was called at the time, Tsaritsyn or something like that. And it was under siege by the Bolsheviks, and he was using his aircraft to bomb their craft in the rivers, which is, as far as I can tell, one of the first uses of aerial bombing on ships in that kind of an environment. And Kalashaw also was one of these guys who had 9 lives and always seemed to survive. And at one point he came down, was really sick, and he was evacuated on a train back behind the lines. But somewhere along the lines, the train broke down, and he got particularly sick, and he was taken off the train, and apparently came into the care of a Russian nurse who didn't speak any English. And Kalashaw was basically lost. Nobody knew where he was for a couple of months. He just disappeared. Everybody thought he was dead, but this nurse took him when he was delirious and on the verge of death, and nursed him back to health. And finally he popped up and said, "Oh, sorry chaps, I had a bit of sickness to get over, but here I am. I'm back again, and all's good."
Fighter pilots and nurses, they seem to always find themselves in the same vicinity. After Russia, he stayed on in a very slimmed down service, and it's during this period that the Fleet Air Arm isn't in existence. So the RAF is still providing the Navy with air cover. He ends up in command of an air wing on an aircraft carrier, which you wouldn't really hear that for an RAF pilot these days.
No, it was it was a unique experience, not totally unique, but a formative experience for him, because he spent the better part of 3 years on board HMS Courageous in the Mediterranean mostly. Part of that time they were doing workups on really trying to figure out how to use naval aviation. The Navy and the Air Force had very different concepts of air power. This was still the era of the big ship. The battleship was king. Fleet engagements were all about getting your ships in line and pummeling them with the big guns and everything like that. And the Navy really looked at aircraft as just a new form of scout. So we can send these planes up, we can find where the enemy battle fleet is, and then we can maneuver to engage with our big guns. But Kalashaw was sort of on the forefront of thinking of naval aviation in a very different light, and being a strike force and being able to use bombs and especially torpedoes to go out and deal with the enemy fleet units. And it was something that was very, very uh, the Navy wasn't happy about this attitude. The Navy really didn't want the thunder to be taken from its big guns, but slowly they realized that this was something that was going to happen and all that. An interesting event that took place while Kalashaw was on Courageous was an outbreak of violence in the Middle East. And Courageous was dispatched with a infantry regiment on board to go and deal with it. And he was ordered to use his aircraft in a sort of quelling the civil disputes, to do sort of that kind of air policing that the RAF became famous for. And he learned a lot about operating with the Army during that period, about what aircraft could do. There were cases when the Army requested him to do strikes on a village, and he basically had to say no, because we don't know who it is. And they said, well, we can see there's people running into the house and looting it, and they need to be dealt with. And he had to say back to them, well, yes, we can see that people are running into that burning house and taking things out, but can you tell us if it's looters or if it's the owners trying to rescue their possessions? And they kind of said, well, we're really not very sure. And his answer to that was, well, then we're not going kinetic. We're not firing on these people unless we know what's going on. So it was one of the limitations of things. But by the time Kalashaw was in command in the Western Desert, he had done close air support. He'd worked closely with the Army. He'd worked closely with the Navy. He'd spent a number of months on the ground with an Army column in Persia that was going to deal with some insurgents, and he was riding on a horse and calling in airstrikes for the column as they went through the Iraqi mountains. And so got a very different perspective of air power from the ground up. And all this put him in really great stead, so that when he was commanding the RAF in the Western Desert, he knew what air power could do. He knew what the Navy needed and what their perspective was. He knew what the Army needed and what their perspective was. And it really made him quite unique in the RAF, in having personally experienced all these different sides of the employment of air power, and it all played into how he used air power in the desert.
So by 1940, we have a quite interesting situation in the Western Desert. He really was the right man in the right place for what was about to happen.
Yeah, very much so. He was the sort of the second in command out there. Arthur Longmore was the overall commander of the RAF in the Western Desert, in the Mediterranean at this period, but Kalashaw was his senior commander in Egypt in the Western Desert, and gave him a lot of latitude into what he was going to do. And Kalashaw and Longmore got along really well, because they're both ex-Royal Naval Air Service types. Longmore actually had his flying ticket before the First World War, and was a commander in the Royal Naval Air Service during the First World War, and was sort of reaching the end of his career in the Western Desert, but he was sort of the right man in the right place, as well as Kalashaw.
So I think that sort of the popular remembrance of the Western Desert really starts a couple of years later. 1942, the major battles, the arrival of Montgomery. But if the situation in 1940 was just as dire as they'd find themselves in a little bit later. So what was going on in the Western Desert in 1940, and what was the situation that Kalashaw and his 202 group found themselves in?
Yeah, I think you've hit on a really interesting point there. For a lot of people, the Western Desert in 4041 just isn't worth talking about. And it really starts with Operation Crusader in late 41, and then especially with El Alamein and chasing Rommel across the desert. And that sort of early period in 40 and 41 fighting the Italians is kind of written off as, well, the Italians were crap. They weren't very good fighters. They just ran away. And even though we beat them, it really wasn't anything to be proud of. So let's just forget about that and deal with the really important stuff, which was fighting the Germans. But I think that's really not fair. It's not fair to what the RAF and the British Army did in Operation Compass, and it's really not fair to the Italians. They certainly had their problems. They It's easy to come up with that view that they were cowards or timid or didn't want to fight or didn't want to sacrifice for Mussolini. But that's not at all fair. And they had some problems, but they also had some really good equipment. They had some really good pilots, some really good soldiers that were getting stuff done. And the victory wasn't about Italian failure. It was about British dominance, and Kalashaw played a big role in that. So the war in the Western Desert started on the 10th of June, 1940. Up until then, there was no active fighting in the desert, but Mussolini wanted to get into the fight. He saw how things were going in France and in the Battle of Britain, which was just on the horizon, and he wanted to sort of regain the glory of the Roman Empire. So he was all set to take advantage of the British as they're looked to be having the boot put to them by the Germans, and wanted to capture Egypt, wanted the Suez Canal, wanted East Africa for his new Roman Empire. So he declared war on the 10th of June. He ordered his forces into Egypt, and they advanced about 50 miles and then stopped about sort of halfway to Alexandria and built a bunch of camps in the desert. And it's not really clear why they did this. Their commander said that he wasn't strong enough to go any farther, which may or may not have been true, but basically he ceded the advantage to the British at that point. Now, the Italians vastly outnumbered the British during this period, both in troops on the ground, in terms of Air Force numbers, pilots, everything like that. And they also had interior lines of communication. So if the Italians were wanting for anything, Italy and Rome were just across the Mediterranean. For the British to get anything there, they had to come down the Mediterranean and risk getting sunk or shot up by the Italians. And later on, they to get aircraft, they brought in this route across the breadth of Africa called the Takoradi route, where they would land aircraft in crates on the west coast of Africa, assemble them, and fly them all the way across Africa, and then up the Nile River Valley to get to Egypt, which was a safe way of doing it in terms of avoiding enemy contact, but it was long, it was dangerous. There was a lot of aircraft lost during that route and stuff like that. But Kalashaw understood completely that he was at the end of a long communications line, that he had finite resources, that if he lost aircraft, they would be gone. If he lost pilots, he couldn't replace them. And but he also realized that if they were going to be effective, they had to be aggressive. So he had second class equipment, sometimes third class equipment. I mean, we're not talking about new Spitfires and Hurricanes like the British were flying in metropolitan England. We're talking about Gloucester Gladiators, a biplane fighter. We're talking about Bristol Bombays, which is an old biplane transport that they used as a bomber. In the early days of the fighting in the Western Desert, they had exactly one modern Hawker Hurricane at their disposal. And Kalashaw realized that he could fake the Italians by being aggressive. So he used it offensively. He had some Blenheim bombers, which had proven to be very ineffective in the Battle of France and were getting shot out of the sky by Messerschmitts. But in the Western Desert, they were very effective, both as bombers, and he put four machine guns on the front of them and turned the Blenheim into a fighter, and it was very effective against the Italians. So he would have a team of two Blenheim fighters and this single Hawker Hurricane, which was eventually dubbed Colley's battleship. And he would fly it around. He would use different pilots, so it was in the air a lot. He would change the markings on it so the Italians didn't know there was just one of them. And it was very effective at putting the Italians on their back foot. They became defensive. The one thing that Kalashaw had learned over the Western Front was that combat air patrols were probably the most ineffective use of air resources you could possibly have. It took an enormous amount of aircraft to keep an air umbrella over your troops. because they had to be there flying around, drilling holes in the sky and not seeing anything most of the time. But that's exactly what the Italians were doing, because their army was demanding fighter cover. They wanted to see these aircraft over top of them, protecting them. And Kalashaw took advantage of that. He would go around them. He would attack them when he wanted to. And it meant that these Italian fighters flying defensive umbrellas couldn't be used in offensive operations or doing reconnaissance or other things that could be effective.
I've just looked it up because he did have, because this is literally just popped in mind. We've not prepped this one. Roald Dahl would have been one of his men in 80 Squadron at that time, wouldn't he?
Yeah, he absolutely was.
There you go.
Yep.
So if you've ever read Going Solo, that's a little taste of what we're talking about now. The Western.
Yeah, because he was flying gladiators, wasn't he?
Yes. Random thought that just popped to my head in the middle of that. So as we get to the tail end of 1940, the focus is still very much on the Channel, but we've got a developing situation on the Egypt-Libya border. What is going to be happening in the last few months of 1940 and the first few months of 1941 that is going to be the focus of our conversation?
Yeah, so General Wavell, who was the senior army commander in the Middle East, knew that an Italian attack was coming, but he also knew that they could take the advantage. He had under his command a really good ground commander, Richard O'Connor, who commanded the British Army in Egypt and was very aggressive and was arguing that we need to take the initiative, we need to attack. So in November and into early December 1940, they made a plan to attack those Italian camps in the Western Desert as a way of taking back the initiative from the Italians. And the Italians had built these fortified camps. They were big camps. They had a lot of men, a lot of tanks in them, wire minefields all the way around them. And in many ways, it was their Maginot Line in the desert, that they were just sitting in there waiting for the enemy to come to them. And O'Connor looked at it and realized that fighting in the desert was very much like naval combat, much more than fighting on ground, in that you could go anywhere you wanted in the desert as long as the terrain was flat. And these defended camps, which were eastward facing, that had their biggest minefields in front of them and were defended all around, but were weaker in the back, it was very easy for him to maneuver his forces and attack them from the west, which is what he did. So they planned this offensive called Operation Compass. That was to be a limited 5-day offensive that was meant to reduce these Italian camps. And it was enormously successful, way more successful than anybody had expected. They attacked the southernmost camp first using tanks from the 7th Royal Tank Regiment and British troops, and captured the first camp, and it fell really easily. The tanks the British had, I believe it was the Matilda, were basically untouchable to the Italians. They had a gun that could destroy any Italian tank, and their armor was virtually impervious to any Italian gun. And so they sort of had their way with the Italians, and they reduced first one camp and then another camp. And in a matter of days, they had totally destroyed the Italian position, captured tens of thousands of Italians, and sent the rest fleeing back into Libya, into Cyrenaica. And at that point, they had to make a decision. Do we call it quits, or do we sort of maintain this momentum when we've got the Italians on their heels? And O'Connor was all for going forward. Kalashaw said, let's do it. And Wavell came around and said, okay, we'll continue. So the next objective was Bardia, which was the first big Italian town across the Egyptian border. And Wavell was very hesitant about attacking it because it was a really strongly fortified position. It was a town that the Italians had identified as their frontline defensive position since 1939, and they'd spent an enormous amount of time and energy and wealth fortifying it. They had an 18-mile perimeter that went around the port that had minefields and barbed wire and concrete positions to protect it. It was backed by at least one second fighting position. It had oodles of artillery protecting it, and it was a really tough nut to crack. And when Allied intelligence was giving them information about this. They thought there was about 15,000 to 20,000 Italian troops that were manning it, and about 100 guns. Well, as it turned out, British intelligence was absolutely wrong on that, and it was something more like 40,000 Italians defending it and 400 artillery pieces. And against that, the British had a newly arrived Australian infantry division, the 6th under General Mackay, or maybe it's Mackay, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, and the 7th Armored Division, and that was it. Maybe 20,000 men all up. And that's not the way you attack heavily defended positions. You usually want an abundance of numbers. You want more men, 3-to-1, 4-to-1 advantage, more artillery, and the British didn't have that. And Wavell knew the odds were about 1-to-1. He didn't realize they were actually sort of 1-to-2, which is not good. And his instinct was he outlined the plan to London and said, "There's 3 options. One, we can invest and try to capture the town. 2, we can bypass it, or 3, we can sort of leave the door open to encourage them to retreat and surrender or retreat to Tobruk." And he said, the 3rd option is probably the best for us. We're not strong enough to take it. If we bypass it, we'll risk exposing our lines of communication. And the best thing is to encourage the Italians to leave of their own accord. So the 7th Armored Division, their support group, had already cut the road between Bardia and Tobruk, and he ordered them out of there to sort of open that door. And they made a demonstration to the southeast to sort of encourage them. Kalashaw used his aircraft to attack, to say, maybe you chaps want to leave. But the Italians were firmly decided that they were staying, so they had to reevaluate what they were going to do.
So the battle itself is quite interesting, because we're going to be looking at all arms of British military strength in this. You've got Kalashaw with the RAF, you've got the Royal Navy off the coast with quite a heavy amount of firepower, and then you have the army with the Australians joining in as well. So one of my little passions is always the Navy in this period as well, because it's in that transitional period. And one of the ships at Bardia is, of course, the famous HMS Barham, isn't it? Which would sadly suffer a very terrible fate only a few months after this. So we're talking big gun battleships off the coast, an outnumbered air force and an outnumbered army going up against a mini Tobruk. Is that a fair surmise?
Yeah, and in fact, I would say the defenses in Bardia were way stronger than anything they had at Tobruk. After Bardia was finally captured, the British would go on to capture Tobruk, and it was an even easier task that they had there. But no, Bardia was a tough nut, and there was nothing that said this was going to go. And the Italians were well entrenched in there. And their opposition was going to be the 6th Australian Division in their very first fight. They hadn't been engaged in the first part of Operation Compass. The 4th Indian Division had been part of the British force under O'Connor and had been very effective, but they were pulled off and sent back to India, and the Australians replaced them. So this was going to be their first big fight. And usually you don't want to put green troops in a situation like this, but O'Connor had no other option. His other troops were tired. They had been exhausted in the first phase of Compass, and he had to use what he had. But the Australians acquitted themselves way better than anybody could have ever expected. I mean, if you ask the Australians themselves, they'd say, of course, it's that Anzac spirit. Of course, we were going to be successful. But I don't think that's fair. It's not fair to the green men of the 6th Division, and it's not fair to the Italians. And one thing that's always struck me, and I was really surprised when I started looking into the Bardia battle, is that it's really looked at in most sources as a infantry armor battle, that the success came from the resolute determination of the Australians and the great support provided by the 7th Royal Tank Regiment. And you only see air power and the Navy come in a tangential manner. The best two books that have been written on this are by an Australian named Craig Stockings, and he's written a really thick monograph on Bardia, which is absolutely fantastic. He gets into all the details of the battle, and he does have one chapter on the Navy and the Air Force, and he understands the role they played, but that's not part of his story. And then he subsequently wrote a second book on it that's part of the Australian Army historical series, and it's kind of like a Osprey book in that it's shorter, it's really well illustrated, it's got lots of asides about equipment and commanders, and it's just a really excellent book. And I mean, I know that's a book written for the Australian Army, but nothing is in there at all about the Navy story or the Air Force story, and that's unfortunate. Craig's a good friend of mine, so I'm not saying anything to you that I haven't already said to him. But the fact of the matter is that as brave and as effective as the Australians are, you can't understand this victory in terms of it being a one-dimensional infantry armor battle. There had to be something more there. And as I looked at it, I realized that answer was that this was a very effective joint operation. Kalashaw was using his relatively small force to its maximum effect and having a really big impact on the way operations went. And the Royal Navy, which was predominant in the Mediterranean at this phase, was using way more firepower than you would ever have expected on this place to also batter the Italians. So let's spend the next few minutes and talk about what the Air Force and the Army and the Navy were doing, because it's really quite an interesting story. As I sort of alluded to earlier, the Air Force is not at its best when it's supporting the Army on the battlefield. And this became really clear later in the war, especially in Normandy, where the Army has a very difficult time hitting the kinds of targets that the Army wants. So the Army wants the Air Force to hit gun positions, troop concentrations, things like that. And those are really difficult targets to find. They're even more difficult targets to hit, and they're exceedingly difficult targets in terms of the attrition of the friendly air forces. They're very costly in attacking them. The Air Force is much more effective when it's doing attacks against the lines of communications, when it's cutting off the battlefield, where it's preventing the movement of reinforcements and supplies and preventing the enemy air force from coming into the battle. And that's exactly what Kalashaw had his squadrons doing at this point. They weren't, for the most part, attacking targets in the Bardia perimeter. They were attacking Tobruk, Benina, other Italian airfields and bases to the west, to prevent the movement of Italian troops to reinforce, to prevent supplies from coming in, to especially keep the Regia Aeronautica out of the battle, the Italian Air Force, and doing that. And they're also working with the Navy very closely, because the biggest threat to the Navy are airstrikes from the Italian aircraft. So whenever the Royal Navy sortied out to make attacks on Bardia, or earlier in the Desert Campaign, they were making attacks on Sollum and other positions along the coast. Kalashaw would send his squadrons out to do what he called fumigation raids, which is just an absolutely delightful title. Fumigation is about keeping the pests away, getting the insects killed. And that's exactly what he was doing. He was attacking airfields to keep the pests down, to keep the Italians from sending their aircraft after the Royal Navy. And it shows really how closely the Air Force and the Navy were cooperating during this period.
And the Air Force was quite outnumbered. I made a note from your book that Kalashaw's force had 48 fighters and 116 bombers against 191 Italian fighters and 140 bombers. So it's in total it's 2-1, but just on that fighters, it's a quarter. He's only got a quarter of the force that he's up against. So keeping them out of the fight would have been vital.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, Kalashaw was criticized afterwards, and in fact during the campaign, as being too aggressive. Arthur Tedder, who was the deputy to Longmore, after he arrived about the same time as Operation Compass was getting started, he had said to Longmore that Kalashaw was being too aggressive and he was wasting his aircraft in frivolous attacks and things like that. And Longmore looked at it and realized that there's sort of a sharp knife's edge between being aggressive and being wasteful. And Kalashaw was always erring on the side of being aggressive but not wasteful. And he understood completely the danger of losing aircraft and things, but he also understood that the Italians had to be challenged. They had to be pushed to keep them defensive, because as long as the Italians were being defensive, they couldn't use their greater strength against the British, which would have been fatal in a lot of ways. So Kalashaw's the quality of his aircraft were improving by this point in the campaign, whereas earlier his main fighters would have been Gloucester Gladiators with just that single Hurricane. By the time of Operation Compass, he had 2 full squadrons of Hurricanes, and that offered him a qualitative advantage over the Italians, who were still mostly flying the CR-42s, which was a biplane that was roughly equivalent to the Gloucester Gladiator. So Kalashaw had an advantage in having that Hawker Hurricane available. And the Italians also, not only did they favor those defensive operations, they were also, I don't know how to describe it without sounding negative about them, because I'm not trying to be. They valued flash over substance. They would much rather have a long dogfight that was throwing aircraft all over the skies and sort of a gladiator kind of contest, rather than sneaking up and shooting the plane down before you knew they were there, kind of thing. Like, that was kind of the mindset they had, and Kalashaw took advantage of that, because he realized that we're not going to get in these long dogfights with these Italians. That's not to our advantage. We're going to sneak up and destroy them as quickly as possible, or even better, we're going to blow up or shoot up their planes on their airfields before they can even get into the air, and stop them that way.
It's the pragmatism of a commander who has done it all, really, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So so that's the Air Force side of it. Kalashaw is also being very impactful in the battle by providing aerial reconnaissance. The entire battlefield is mapped out with air reconnaissance photos, and these prove absolutely key, because they allow the planners to find out the weak spots in the enemy defenses, and plan their attacks. So rather than attacking from the southeast, where the Italians are expecting the attack, which is sort of closest to the Egyptian border, they realize that if they go around most of the perimeter and attack in the northwest corner, not only are the defenses somewhat weaker there, they also found a spot that was sort of on the border between 2 separate defending formations, and they could sort of create chaos by attacking on that seam. And it ended up being very successful. In fact, the initial Australian attack was in many ways a perfect form of the German blitzkrieg. Have all your weight go on to a very small point, break through the enemy defenses, and then spread out behind and roll up the enemy defenses. And that's exactly what they did.
Did intelligence ever figure out that there was twice as many Italians defending Bardia, or was that just a surprise as the battle went on?
Yeah, I don't think I never saw anything that they really understood that was the case as the battle was proceeding. And I mean, it was over in 72 hours. I think when they first realized, it was really when all the prisoners started being collected, and there was some 35,000 plus Italians that were captured in this battle, which is just ridiculous. I posted some photos earlier that just show these fields of prisoners. One of my favorite quotes from the period came from a British Army officer in the first phase of Operation Compass, who was asked by headquarters to report on how many prisoners they'd captured, and his response was about 7 acres.
Well, what I'll do is when we put this episode out live, I'll tag in your thread, because it's a superb thread on the battle if people want to have a look at those photographs as well.
Sure.
Let's talk about the Navy for a minute, because I'm going to say the poor Italians, because they're sat in a catchment being fired upon by 15-inch guns, which, just saying that, it doesn't sound very nice.
No, and the the British certainly used their naval advantage to their great advantage in this battle. They had a formation called the Inshore Squadron, which was centered on the HMS Terror, which was a monitor. It was a really kind of odd-looking ship that it was quite small, but it had this enormous turret with two 15-inch guns in it, and it was really just a mobile gun platform. And then it had a number of gunboats with 6 or 8-inch guns, and they would come in and pummel. But the real ace they had up their sleeve was the battleships of the Royal Navy, the Warspite, and I think there was 2 others that were part of this, and they would come and sit off the coast and fire their 15-inch shells at Bardia, which was a sort of a 2-part town. There was an upper town on the cliffs overlooking the port, and then a lower town. And just I can't imagine what it would be like being underneath the firepower of these 15-inch shells. I mean, a 15-inch shell is sort of the size of a Volkswagen. It's like just absolutely enormous, and a huge explosion, leaving these massive craters. And it just must have, if it didn't kill you, it would drive you insane.
Yeah, it was Byron was a survivor of Jutland, so that's the size of firepower that you're firing in. Always makes me smile when I see Terror pop up, as it always makes me think of Franklin, because it's an Erebus class monitor named HMS Terror. And if you're Canadian, you immediately know what we're talking about. And if you don't know what you're talking about, please read up on Franklin, because it's fascinating.
And it's been found.
It has, yes. That's another podcast for another time. So, as you said, it's a 72-hour battle with colossal losses to the Italians, not so much in casualty, but in the amount of troops surrendering. What happens as towards the end of that 72 hours? You've got the Italians requesting more support as they start realizing what is actually going on.
Yeah, the Italian commander was a guy named General Bergonzoli, who was nicknamed Electric Whiskers because he had this great big mane of hair on his face. And he was a really respected Italian general, but he was also manipulated by Mussolini and kind of putting his own character at stake in the defense of Bardia. By all rights, he probably should have taken Wavell's invitation and given up Bardia and moved on to Brook and really had a very strong garrison there, but he didn't, and he stayed and he fought and he lost. But from his perspective, he thought he had a really solid defensive position. He had concrete positions, fighting positions where there'd be an anti-tank gun in concrete surrounded by concrete pillboxes and machine gun posts and lots of wire and lots of minefields, and it seemed like there was no chance that they could be weeded out. But Italian morale was suspect. I mean, they just had that big loss from Operation Compass, very unexpected, and that had to play into their psyche. And the troops that were under Bergonzoli's command weren't all Italian. I don't know the breakdown, but there was a substantial number of Libyan troops, which are sort of local North African militia that are under his command, and some of them were quite good, but the overall quality of them was probably not up to the quality of the average Italian soldier.
I think I read in your book that there was a request almost in the clear for every Italian aircraft in the area to come and help, wasn't there?
Yeah, and I mean, the Italians tried to impact the battle using the Air Force, but for the most part, they couldn't get there. Their first instinct was to attack the Royal Navy off the coast, which was a good idea, but it really didn't get at the core of what their problem was, and it kind of wasted any effort that they had. And in the end, most of their aircraft doing that were either shot down or turned back, and they didn't have any impact on the Navy ships. They did have one success on the 3rd of January when they attacked the headquarters of the 16th Infantry Brigade, the Australian 16th Infantry Brigade, and killed about 6 guys and impacted their effectiveness for a while. But that was really the exception rather than the rule. And the Italian accounts afterwards are really quite remarkable. They said that going into this battle, we completely expected to be attacked by the Italian Air Force. We expected to see fighters over us all the time and to be cowering because of it, but they really weren't there. And for that, we can thank the RAF, and it was a big part of their story.
So that's really the seeds of the tactical air power that we would come to know in later campaigns. It's moving that interdiction much further behind the lines to make sure that the support isn't there in the first place, not trying to counter that support while the troops on the ground are fighting that battle.
Yeah, I find this as a really great missed opportunity for the Allied war effort, because Bardia really should have been studied as a case study of how we do these kind of things, how we employ the Army in cooperation with the Air Force, in cooperation with the Navy, and what each one's role is and how it works and why it works. But I think so much of it was character driven rather than doctrine driven. Kalashaw got along really well with O'Connor, and they teamed up. They had their headquarters co-located, which is something that is always credited as a innovation of Conningham later in the war. But O'Connor and Kalashaw were doing it at this point in the war, and they understood what each one needed and what each one could do, and they got on with their jobs. Later on, Kalashaw was gone, O'Connor was gone, and new people came in, and they didn't quite get it in the same way. And I would say one of the big problems with this was Tedder at this point in the war. And Tedder, I'm probably going to get some flack for this, because Tedder goes on to become one of the great heroes of the Royal Air Force. Air Chief Marshal, commands the RAF during Operation Overlord in the Northwest Europe campaign, and becomes one of the RAF's exceptional leaders in that period. But for me, his conduct of operations in 1940 and 41 is solely lacking. He doesn't quite get it. He is trying to figure things out, and he doesn't intuitively understand air power in the way that Kalashaw does during this point. So later on, I guess it's June 1941. This is after the Germans have come into the war. They've pushed the British back out of Libya. They're threatening Egypt again, and the British come up with a new plan, Operation Battle Axe, to relieve Tobruk, which has been invested by the Germans, and try to push the Germans out of Cyrenaica. And it's an operation that comes in the aftermath of Greece and Crete, which have drained off RAF resources in the aftermath of Operation Compass. And the RAF doesn't come off very well in those operations, partly because they're asked to do the kind of things that the Army doesn't want them doing and can't see them doing. So the average British soldier and the British commanders in Greece and Crete see the German Stukas coming down and attacking them, and they're like, "Where's the RAF? Why aren't they defending us?" And the RAF gets some interesting nicknames in this phase. Instead of Royal Air Force, it's Royal Absent Force, or my favorite, which is Rare as Fairies. But the Army really doesn't like the RAF at this period. And so in Battle Axe, which occurs after the evacuation of Crete, Tedder listens to the Army and says who want to see the RAF. They want to see the RAF doing combat air patrols over their frontline troops. The exact thing that got the Italians into so much trouble earlier in the campaign is now what Tedder is ordering Kalashaw to do. And Kalashaw says, "But sir, this is not the way to do it. We can be aggressive. We can do what we did before." And he says, "No, we have to allow the Army to feel we're doing our job." So he reined in Kalashaw and Battle Axe, and the first 2 days of Battle Axe were an absolute and complete failure, because the RAF couldn't do anything to help the battle. And in one of the key engagements on the second day, the Germans were able to move about the battlefield without any fear of being interdicted, and it was the difference in the battle. On the third day, Tedder finally began to realize that something was wrong with his employment of the Air Force. Part of it was Churchill, who was closely watching the battle, saying, "Why isn't the RAF having an impact?" And on the third day, Tedder released Kalashaw to do what he wanted, and it made a big difference. It was probably the difference between the British being able to extricate their forces and get away cleanly from the operation, or being completely encircled and destroyed in detail by the Germans. And that's Kalashaw's doing.
It wasn't long after Battle Axe before Tedder rang the changes, and his right-hand man would come in, and they'd take the lessons learned in the desert and build on them for the rest
Yeah,
of the war.
Tedder fired Kalashaw about a month after Battle Axe concluded at the end of the summer of 1941, and brought in Arthurconningham, who was his own guy. And Conningham and Tedder and Montgomery would go on to sort of create or be credited with creating that system of Allied air support that was used for the rest of the war in Sicily, in Italy, in Normandy, and Northwest Europe. And Conningham, in particular, was credited as the man who came up with this system, who created the way that the air forces would operate and the kind of missions they would fly and everything like that. And it's not quite the case. Conningham really came in and he had this system that was about 75% complete, maybe even more, and had been created by Kalashaw primarily. And he took it and he tweaked it, and he made some changes that weren't necessarily doctrinal based, but were more based on abundance. He was able to do things with the Desert Air Force that Kalashaw could only have dreamed of, because he now had more planes, more fighters, more bombers, more transport, more fitters and armorers and mechanics and things like that. So he was able to sort of finish the souffle, so to say, and took credit for the whole thing. Meanwhile, Tedder basically spent the rest of his life slandering Kalashaw and writing him off and everything like that. And I'd always thought for a long time, because when Tedder showed up in the Middle East in December 1940, it was clear right from the start that he didn't like Kalashaw and wanted to get rid of him. And I'm quite sure that there was something that happened in the interwar period that they crossed paths. And Kalashaw was loud. He was brash. He was the fighter pilot persona. He liked his drink. He was the life of the mess and everything like that. And Tedder was more the quiet, bookish sort, who was more reserved and sort of that upper class British type. And I'm sure there was some incident in a mess where Kalashaw had a few drinks and Tedder crossed him, and Tedder never forgot that. But I've never been able to track that down. But in the aftermath of Kalashaw's command in the Western Desert, I really think, and this is something that I've sort of just been thinking through lately, that Kalashaw was the epitome of everything that Tedder had done wrong in those early years. So Tedder's way of dealing with it was to bury Kalashaw. He fired him, he got him out of the desert, and after the war, when he was writing his memoirs, which are very aptly titled "With Prejudice," he made sure that Kalashaw came off as he called it, the village slogger in village cricket, when he wasn't right for the sort of the real game of cricket and everything like that. So made it clear that Kalashaw wasn't operating at a high level when really he was, and Tedder was the one that had the problem. So I think that was his way of covering his early mistakes in his career.
I think that's a good way of putting it. It's a definite culture clash. The boy from Nanaimo, BC, and the lad who went to Whitgift School, Croydon, if you're listening, and Cambridge. It's you can't get two chalk and cheese upbringings than British Columbia in the early 1900s and South London. Mind you, South London's a pretty fierce training ground for everyone, as I well know. So Kalashaw, what happened in his later life? Because he didn't stay in the RAF for the duration of the war, did he? He was retired.
Yeah, he was very clear when he said in his memoirs, "I was retired." And it's very odd. I mean, he came back from the Western Desert, and he was given some commands in more senior staff jobs in fighter command in London, and then he was given command of 14 Group up in Scotland for about a year. But that was at a point after the conclusion of the Battle of Britain, and it was really sort of a backwater training area, and he wasn't really doing much. He had some health problems during this period. It's clear he was in hospital for, I'm not even sure what, because the records don't give me detail on that. And in 1943, he was retired in the middle of the war, which seems very odd for somebody that was a very effective commander. Was not over the hill. He wasn't too old. It wasn't like Dowding, who sort of was on the verge of retiring before the war, but was kept on and then kind of had to retire because he was sort of aging out of the service. He wasn't the oldest. He wasn't anywhere near the oldest. And he took on a job with Civil Air Defense in the UK for the rest of the war. After the war, he returned to Canada with his wife and his two daughters, and kind of put the Air Force behind him and engaged in a career as a mining executive, exploring mining tracts in the British interior and on Vancouver Island, very much like his father had. And he also became a sort of a self-starter historian. He wrote oodles of stuff. He was very interested in collecting rosters of fighter pilots from the First World War. He was one of the first people trying to figure out who shot down the Red Baron and trying to sort of tally the various accounts of that. He compiled lists of all the great aces from all the nations of the First World War and stuff like that, and was an inveterate letter writer, talking to just about anybody who was interested about his First World War career. Remarkably, the stuff in his papers is much less on his Western Desert campaign. He didn't talk about that near as much. He never said a bad word about Tedder, which to me is very telling about his character and who he was as a man. But he lived a long and healthy life. He finally passed away in 1976, which is outlasting most of his contemporaries.
A truly remarkable character. I can highly recommend your book, which I'm ashamed to say I've read the first half of that we've discussed. What's it called? Where can you find it?
Yeah, it's called Flying to Victory, Raymond Kalashaw and the Western Desert Campaign, 1940 to 1941. It's published by Oklahoma University Press, and you can find it on Amazon, or you can get an ebook from your favorite vendor. It is an Air Force history, but it is also a history of the Western Desert Campaign up until and through Battle Axe. And I think in some ways it's as important account of Battle Axe has been written. So I highly commend you to read it.
I shall finish it, I promise. As everyone's going to want to follow you on the social medias, how can they find you on those?
Yeah, Twitter is the best place. My handle is Mike_Bechthold. And you can find that on the Twitter feed of History Hack and everything like that. So I don't have to spell it for you, but yeah, you'll get lots of opinions on the COVID mess we're in, and about the Canadians in the Second World War and air power and stuff like that. So yeah, please do come and follow me, and let's have a chat.
Thank you so much, Mike. That was really good fun. Our next History Hack Hedge-Hopping will be out in a month's time. It will be Allison Engine Mustangs with Matt Willis. So we will be looking at the legend before she became a legend. Thank you very much for listening. In 2020, when the boss ladies, Alex and Alina, started History Hack, the world was very strange. And unfortunately, it looks like 2021 is going to be equally strange. We would love it if you're able to support the podcast in any way. It will allow us to keep up the regularity of the pods and also the great guests that we've been able to bring you over the last year. We exist on Patreon as History Hack, and also on Podbean, our podcast host's own platform called Patreon. The reward tiers are being updated at the moment, so there's going to be some fantastic options for you to choose from. So if you're able to support us, that would be fantastic. So we thank you very much, and until the next time, bye.